All right, the second letter. We learn in this letter that Wormwood's patient, the man he's trying to tempt, has become, well, a Christian. He's recently converted to Christianity. And of course, that's a good thing or a bad thing for the demon. And yet, Screwtape is sure to tell his nephew not to worry. And why? Because he says all the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. So even though he's been converted to Christianity, even though he's joined the church, even though he's begun to, well, go to church and consider himself as Christian, he still carries with him, well, all of those habits that, well, lead him astray from God. That's just the case. Even though we might be baptized, we still carry within ourselves, well, a bit of that disorder of the original sin. We still carry with us what's called concupiscence. Our nature is still not yet, well, made perfect. That's something that happens over the course of our lives. It's something that happens over the course of cooperating with God's grace. It doesn't just happen all at once. How easy it would be if it, well, did, but it doesn't. And so what Screwtape is telling Wormwood is to continue to, well, plague his patient at those habits, those vices, the brokenness within him. And one of the things that, well, he tries to play up on is, well, the man's annoyance with all of the other Christians. Because indeed, what Screwtape tells Wormwood is that, hey, one of the tools in our tool shed, so to speak, is to point out, well, the reality of the church. Now, he's very quick to say, I do not mean that church that is spread throughout all time and space and rooted in eternity, terrible as an army with all of its banners, the angels and the saints. He doesn't mean that picture of the church. He even admits that that picture of the church, that reality of the church, actually scares most, well, demons, even some of the best. Probably even scares and puts a lot of fright into the devil himself. When he talks about the church being, well, part of their armament, what he means is the very, well, plain and the very real, the very gritty reality of the people that are in the church. And so what Screwtape wants Wormwood to point out to his patient is all of the people that come and all of those little annoyances that he has for them, all of the different types of pride that he might carry within his heart in regards to relationships with them. Those sorts of vices can really play up to lead the patient further and further away from God rather than being ever close. And so even though we're in the visible church, we have to always realize and recognize that the church is much larger than what we can see. It's much more than just the people around us. That indeed the angels and the saints, that the very, well, reality of heaven itself is in communion with us. That the church, the body of Christ, is partly here, but it's partly elsewhere too. And we can't be, well, so disheartened by the different realities of the here and the now, especially when it comes to the fallen realities of us who continue to be sinners. Because the sin is what God has come to, well, wash away. The things that tend to drag us down are the things that God is desiring to free us from. And not only us, but from the others as well. You know, at the very end of this letter, Screwtape points out that because he's so smug, the patient will actually kind of look at all the others and think to himself, well, think better of himself. Think of himself as something that is greater than they. And even though he knows in his heart of hearts that he is a sinner as well, that he is broken as well, just like, well, everyone else. And so Screwtape points out, he's like, it's amazing, Wormwood, that these human beings would actually fall into that trap of thinking better of themselves as people not having sin, when it's so obviously the fact that they do. Or they think themselves as being so different than everyone else because everyone else's sins are just so much bigger, when in fact they're not. We as Christians, when we are part of the body of Christ, we're a part of the body of Christ because of our humility, and that should always be first and foremost. so as not to let the demons kind of play up our pride and lead us away from actually having a heart that has been changed and transformed by the mercy of God. The last thing I like to point out about this letter, Screwtape talks about this disappointment. He talks about this anticlimax, which certainly comes to not only his patient, Wormwood's patient, but also to anybody who is ever on the threshold of every human endeavor. And so whether it is that someone is trying to learn Greek and right at the beginning of it, and they get all excited about learning Greek, what does Screwtape point out is that right after it becomes an idea, an endeavor, a goal, and now it's in the reality of actually having to do something about it, we always have a sense of a little bit of a disappointment. There's always a bit of a letdown. Screwtape even points out, when it comes to marriage, there's the same thing. Two lovers, fall in love and they get engaged and they're all excited and then they get married. And then reality starts to set in. And that reality is kind of hard to contend with. And there's certain disappointments in that because there's a certain, amount of growth that needs to happen. And Screwtape admits that this is actually a risk. He says the enemy, or God, takes this risk because he has a curious fantasy of making all these, what he calls the disgusting little human vermin into what God calls his free lovers, his servants, the sons and daughters of his family. And indeed, we know God, he takes a risk on us when he loves us. He desires us to be free. He desires us to actually, respond and to feel the weight of that choice so that we might also feel the weight of the glory that God desires to share with us. And so we should expect, whether we are just getting married or trying to learn Greek, or if we are digging into harvest and going out to work in the field, that after, we get out and set to work, it might just be the case that we start to get disappointed. We start to kind of lose faith, lose heart, that we can actually make it through. We should expect this and persevere. Because if we persevere, what does Screwtape say? But that's when, we are kind of lost to them. Because once we stop, basing our decision off of that emotion or just doing what feels good, and we actually base our decision off of what we know to be good, even when it's difficult, he says that it's very difficult for us to be tripped up. Because what does the demon want to do? They want to trip us up based off of emotion, based off of how we feel. And so if we don't feel like reading the Screwtape letters today, the demon is certainly going to tempt us away from reading what is good for us, because ultimately he knows that he can play up our emotions and our feelings. And yet if we just resolve that, no, we are going to read, or no, we are going to get up even though we're tired, and we're going to go to Mass, or no, we are going to set aside that time, that 10 minutes, that 15 minutes, even though it's difficult to do so, and actually pray. The demons know that if we do that, if we are firm in our resolution, if we persevere through what is difficult, it's then that, in a sense, God has shown forth his victory in us, because he has offered us a free choice to love, and even when it was difficult, we still freely chose. And there's nothing greater, I guess, in our act of conversion than to persevere when times are difficult. Indeed, times are difficult today, and so I think that's a wonderful message for all of us. So persevere, and hope to see you in chapter 3.